In this video, we're going to talk about what are values, we're going to talk about what are variables, and we are going to look at what happens when you make various different kinds of mistakes, how Visual Studio tells you that you've made a mistake, and how you can fix it. Writing programs is all about manipulating data, right? So consider this banana, right? This banana has some properties, right? It's got some amount of mass that you might measure in grams. It's got a length. It's got a curvature. You might measure those things as some kinds of fractions. It's got a position. It's got a velocity. Those things can all change. It might have data associated with it, like the date that I bought it, or the date that it had to be sold by, or the date that it was picked. It also has data associated with it, like the price that I paid for it. What have we got here? We've got integers. We've got quantities like I've got 3 bananas. That's an integer. We've got physical data, right? Like its position or its speed. We've got data that is prices. We've got data that is dates. We could have data that was text, right? We could give this banana a name. We could call it Bob the banana, right? So there's lots of different kinds of data that we might want a program to manipulate. And how do we do that? Well, data is stored in variables, right? Now, how data storage works is not particularly relevant, right? C# has been very carefully designed so that the details of where in memory a particular variable is located and what the lifetime of that memory is and how it's going to be reclaimed and all of that stuff that you might have to think about in other programming languages like C or C++, you don't have to think about in C#, right? So think about it very abstractly, right? You think that a variable is a box that you can put something in, right? So a variable is a storage location for a value. Now in this course, we are mostly going to be looking at local variables. Local variables, they have names. They are always associated with a method. And they always store a particular kind of data. And we'll look at all of that in more detail. There are lots of different kinds of variables in C#. In this course, we're going to look at local variables, and we're going to look at variables that are associated with elements of an array in a later video. But for now, we'll just look at local variables. Right? The important thing when you are thinking about variables is to not confuse the box that the banana is in with the banana, right? Those are two different things. It's very easy to do that, right? But just remember, there's the location that the data is stored in, and then there's the data that is stored in it. Those are conceptually two different things. It's easy to confuse them. We'll look at some examples of that. Right? All right, so let's open up Visual Studio here. And you see that I have created a project, and it's got a class program, right, as we've seen. We've got a container for our code. The program class has a main method. Every console application in C# has a main method. And I've created a new variable called number of bananas, right? And I've said that the number of bananas is 1. Although maybe I should say that the number of bananas is 3, because I've got 3 bananas here for some reason. All right, so let's take a look at all of the parts of this little statement here, right? So we have var, right? Var says the thing that follows is going to be a variable, right? It's going to be a brand new variable for this method. And now you might say, well, why var when it could say variable? That's traditional. There's a tradition in programming languages to abbreviate things. I find it irritating. But there it is. There are lots of programming languages that use var to say this is a new variable. There are some languages that use func to say this is a new function. I wish they would just say function. I wish it would just say variable. But var is what we're stuck with. OK, so this says what's coming next is a variable. Right? The thing that follows that is the name of the variable, then an equal sign, then the value that is going to be stored in the variable, and then a semicolon. Right? So if we take a look at how that's broken down, always var, variable name equals value, semicolon. And that's called a declaration statement, or a local variable declaration statement. A couple more things to notice about this. One is that variable names are traditionally in C#, if they are multiple words, the words are all run together. The first word is always lowercased, and then every subsequent word is uppercased. So we have number, right, lowercase, of, uppercase, on the O, small case on the F, uppercase on the B. This is called camel case because it kind of looks like a camel doing this, right? You'll also note that there's a green squiggly underline under this thing, right? And I said before we were going to be talking about what happens if you make mistakes. Well, if we hover our mouse over this thing, it says this is a local variable. It says that it's an integer. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. It's called number of bananas, and then it tells us what's going wrong here. It says the variable number of bananas is assigned, but its value is never used. And that's true. This program doesn't do anything with this. We can step into this program. We can hit F10. We know that that steps in. Right? We can step over the assignment. Right? Now you notice down here we have a window called locals. Right? It's telling us that there are two local variables in this method. There's args, which we're not going to talk about much in this course. I'll just briefly describe what it is. So if you have a console application, think about if you're copying a file using the command prompt, right? You would say copy, and then the name of the source file, and then the name of the destination file, right? If you were writing a program like that, then the name of the source file and the name of the destination file would be represented in this collection of what are called arguments. We'll talk more about arguments in the context of function calls later. But that's not the kind of console application we're going to write in this course. So we're just going to ignore the args for now, right? The important thing is down here we say number of bananas, right? So this is the local variable. And you see that we have 3 in red highlight saying this thing was just now assigned the number 3, right? So Visual Studio is trying to give you a little hint that something important has just happened here. Right? But this program doesn't do anything. So let's stop it and let's make it actually do something. Now, you saw before we could say console.writeLine. And then we could give it some text in quotation marks, right? So we could say number of bananas, semicolon at the end. Now, did you notice something there, right? Just very briefly, before I typed the semicolon there, we had a red squiggly underline here, right? And if I mouse over that, it says, I expected a semicolon here, right? Now, the difference between the green and the red squiggly underline is, the green squiggly underline is, I'm warning you something looks weird here, right? The red squiggly underline is, no, really, this is broken. I'm not going to allow you to proceed. So you might wonder, well, what happens if we do proceed, right? What if I hit F10 to try to step into this thing? Well, Visual Studio says, there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build, right? So the program as it was before I added this line. And I'm not even sure why Visual Studio says this, because I have, in several decades of using Visual Studio, never once hit, yes, I would like to run the previous version. No, I made a mistake. I want to fix it. Right? So I always click no. Right? And it's pretty straightforward what's going on here. Now, the error is also listed down here in this errors and warnings list here. So you see it says there's 1 error, there's 1 warning, and there are 0 messages. There are also messages that do not even reach the level of warnings. They're just telling you that there's something maybe interesting about your code that you should know about, but not that we think that it's wrong. Right? The fact that a variable has been created and then never used, that's likely to be wrong. That's likely to be a mistake. Right? The missing semicolon is a bad enough mistake that the program won't even run. Right? So we'll fix that. You can see the error goes away from the error list. Right? And now if we type console.writeLine, now not in quotes this time, number of bananas. And you notice how IntelliSense thinks that I could be typing number of bananas, right? I'm not sure why it thinks that I could also be typing not finite number exception. That is possible here, but it seems pretty unlikely since I've already typed number. So IntelliSense is not perfect, right? It's trying to figure out what you're likely to type. It's assuming that you're going to make some typing errors. But it's better than nothing, right? So we'll click on number of bananas down here. All right, we'll put in the semicolon. All right, so we'll put a breakpoint here, and then we'll run this program and we'll see what happens. I'm just going to hit F5. All right, so we've run all the way down to the breakpoint. And if we take a look at the console window, you can see it's written out number of bananas, as we expected, the text, and it's written out the number 3, right, which is the value of the variable. All right, so what happens if we want to change the variable. I said that variables contain values and that variables could be changed. Variables are called variables because they vary. So let's try it. Let's say var number of bananas is equal to 2. Well, now we have a red squiggly. So something is going wrong here. Visual Studio is telling us that something's not quite right. If we mouse over that, it says, once again, this is a local variable. It's an integer. It's called number of bananas. A local variable named number of bananas is already defined in this scope. And it also says the variable number of bananas is assigned, but its value is never used. So it's giving us both an error and a warning here, right? It's assuming that we are trying to create a new variable called number of bananas, right? We're never using it, right? It's never used after this point. But it's also wrong because we already have a variable called number of bananas. Now, there was a word in here, scope, and I want to call out that jargon real quick here. The scope of a variable is the portion of the program in which the variable may be referred to by its name. And for a local variable, the scope of a variable is the method in which it is declared, right? We'll see a little later on. That's not quite true. You can create scopes that are smaller than the entire body of the method. But for our purposes right now, the scope of the local variable is the entire method. And there's a rule in C# that says that two local variables of the same name cannot both be in scope at the same time. Why? Because that is super confusing, and it is almost certainly an error, right? If you did that, right? So the language just simply does not allow it, right? What are we gonna do about that? Well, we saw that if we just try to run the program anyway, then it's going to tell us, do you want to run the previous program? We can't simply run it. We're going to have to do something to fix this. So there's two things that we could do. The first thing we could do is we could simply say, this is no longer a declaration of a new variable, right? This is an assignment to an existing variable. So we get rid of the var, because remember, the var means this is a new variable, right? And instead, we'll just say, the value of number of bananas is now 2, right? And so now if we cut and paste this here, right? If we run this code again, then you can see that the console window now says, first it was 3, now it's 2. Right? And if we take a look at that in the debugger, you can see that by the time we've gotten to this point, number of bananas is 2. All right, so that's one of the things that we could do. The other thing that we could do is maybe we were genuinely trying to make a new variable, right? So perhaps I want to say the number of apples is equal to 4. Right? Once again, we get the green squiggly here that says, hey, you created a new variable that you then never used, right? So let's use it. Right? We could print it out as well. And we'll step into this code. And as you can see, number of bananas, we just assigned 3 to it. It says number of apples is 0, right? We have not reached its declaration yet. The locals window here is telling you there is a local variable. It's called number of apples. No value has been assigned to it yet, so it's just going to pretend that it's 0, right? But effectively, it has really no value. Right? Write out the number of bananas, right? Then we assign 2 to that. You notice that in red highlight, we get this 2 here, saying this value has just been changed. Write that out. Then we say that we have the variable number of apples is 4, right? In the locals window, we get the red highlight on 4. And then we can write out the number of apples. And in the window, we get 4. All right, so what else could we do with this thing? Well, let's try something super advanced. We could say console.writeLine. We're going to say number of. Notice how IntelliSense is now figured out, oh, there are 2 things that begin with number. Could be number of apples or number of bananas. And so we'll pick that one. And then I'm going to say number of apples plus number of bananas. Semicolon at the end. And I will bet that you can all predict what this is going to do. Right? We write out 6. Right, because number of apples is 4, number of bananas is 2. And you can see when we mouse over these things, it tells us what is the current value of the variable. It also tells us that down here in the locals window. Unfortunately, if you highlight the whole thing, right, and mouse over it, it does not tell you what the sum is. Right? However, we can right-click on this thing, and we can say Add Watch. Right? And that creates a new window here, right, that says number of apples plus the number of bananas is 6. Right? And then if one of these variables changed, then the value in the watch window would change as well. All right, handy thing, the watch window. All right, so this thing here, number of apples plus number of bananas, this is an example of an expression. And we're going to be talking about expressions in more detail in the next video. So summing up, values are things like numbers, dates, text. Variables are storage locations that store values. Local variables have to be declared exactly once. Right? And the equal symbol assigns the value that is on the right-hand side to the variable that is on the left-hand side.